Yeah, hi, this is Matthias from mamoworld.com, and in this tutorial I want to show you how to work with keyframes in the block editor of automation blocks. And the first thing I want to tell you is that you don't always need to explicitly work with keyframes. If all you want to do is to paste a specific set of keyframes on multiple properties, maybe in a layer, what you can do is to select those keyframes and then in After Effects save those as an animation preset, and this will give you an FFX file. And then with automation blocks in the layer category you find this apply preset block where you can now pick here the FFX file you want to use, and now this would apply this entire preset to the layer that you specify here. So if we want to apply to this layer, we can just click here and now it will paste it here. The only thing I want to mention in addition, when you want to work with preset files, is by default here, this preset file is not included in the script. This means if you send this script or this block script here to somebody else, you would need the FFX file in exactly this same location here. And to avoid this, what you can do is go to Files and use Embedded File, and then you drag this on top of here. And if you now choose here the FFX file again, then with the embedded file, this file will be embedded in your XML script, in your automation blocks tool here, so you can share it with others and don't need to worry if they have this preset file, because it will be part of it. Okay, but now I want to really talk about how to actually work with keyframes instead of working with presets. And for this, we look at the blocks here in the keyframes category. And the most interesting block here is the add keyframes block. In this project, I already have some keyframes here, namely this very basic animation with these two keyframes. And what you can do is just select keyframes here and then click on this refresh button. And you can have arbitrarily many keyframes on one property selected here to make this work. And now these keyframes have been stored inside the script. So they will now also be stored here if you bring this to another machine, if you run this when another project is open. Yeah, these keyframes are now stored effectively in this long text here. And now you can apply those to other properties. So if you want to, for example, apply the keyframes to the position of this layer here, you can click here to refresh, and now it is applied to this property. And if we run this script, you can see that exactly the same keyframes have been pasted, and exactly the same, the two layers make now exactly the same movement. Yeah, let me undo this. And let's say you want to paste the keyframes now at a different point in time. So you can provide here a time value. So if you want to go for the current time, for example, the current time is an attribute of the comp. So we go to comp, get attribute, and we want to have the current time. And you can just plug this in here. And if we run the tool now, it pasted the keyframes at this time, such that the first of the keyframes you have is pasted at this time. Yeah, and if we run it here again, you can see it pasted them a second time. Now it's performing exactly the same move again and again. Let me undo this too, and now show you some very cool feature. And this is if you choose adjustment before. So this is like, how do the newly pasted keyframe change what is already there before the point in time or where we paste our keyframes? Yeah. So you can say here, adjust keyframes before to new keys, or adjust new keys to keys before, and adjust new keys to keys before or value. And this is what we want now. This means check what current value we have or what keyframes we have before the current time, if there are keyframes already. And if so, make sure the new move starts here. Yeah, so we say at this point in time we want to paste the new keyframes, but we don't want to just do stupid copy and paste, but we want to make sure that the animation that these keyframes contain start from right here. So if we run this now, you can see that the layer stays at this point and moves from here. Yeah? And if we run it here again, you can see that the move is pasted again, but again it starts from this location. Okay. Let me quickly undo this again, and now let's assume we have already some keyframes here after the current time. So I set a keyframe here, and I set another one here where we move to the side maybe. Okay, and now I say, okay, the adjustment after, we want to set this to adjust the keyframes after to the new keys. Okay, and if we run this, you can see that now we have first our move down, and now we have our move to the side adjusted after that. Yeah, so this move that we had here before is now effectively moved down. And due to our spatial interpolation, you can see that there is this little curve inside here. So if you go to these keyframes and set the spatial interpolation to linear, this curve is also gone. Now this depends really on what interpolation you have here, but the main idea is that with these settings here, you can smart insert, so to speak, new keyframes, such that the keys before and after adjust to these newly inserted keyframes, or vice versa, to create smooth animations. Now let's see in a bit more detail how we can control to which property those keyframes are pasted. Here currently we've just selected this position and then once clicked this refresh icon here to load this string into this control here, which says inside of the composition 1 on the layer with name in automation blocks. So this is this layer here in the transform group, the property Adobe position. Now, what if we want to apply it to the position of a different layer? Let's say, for example, to the currently selected layer. So then you can just say here with root layer, and this means you want to specify on which layer it is. Yeah, and let me just reveal some other properties here to show you in more detail what's happening. Now we have here with root layer, and it says on this layer we want to have Adobe Transform Group position, so the position property inside of the transform group. If you want to apply to the opacity instead, you could select this property and refresh, and now it says Adobe Transform Group Adobe opacity. Yeah, now it will paste the keys on the opacity keyframes. You can really select any property here you want, and now since we've chosen with root layer blah blah blah, here you can now put a description of the layer that you want. And so we can go to layer, for example, and say use the only selected layer of the currently active comp. And if we do this now, then when this layer is selected, run script, the keyframes are pasted on this layer, and if this layer is selected, run script, the keyframes are pasted on this layer. Okay, so let me clean up this here all a little bit again and see how we could also make this here a little bit more dynamic. So this is like the source from where we take the keyframes. Yeah. So as I explained before, these keyframes are stored as part of the script. They are hard-coded. So this tool we create here will always paste exactly these keyframes. What if you want to do this a little bit more dynamic and say you want to like always use the keyframes of a specific property at this point in time? Yeah, so when the script is executed, not when you create the script. So you could go here to keyframes, and instead of using the keyframe list, which is the default that you use currently, we can also say list of all keyframes of a certain property. And if we drag this in here, then it will use, and we can, for example, select here the position and click here refresh. Now it says read these keyframes from this property when this block is running. Yeah, so this means if we run the script now and want to paste to this layer, it's pasting these keyframes here. And if we insert here another keyframe now and run the tool again without updating anything here, run script, you can see now it pasted these 3 keyframes to the selected layer. So we can also paste it here, for example. Now it pasted these 6 keyframes actually in here. Yeah, so you can see every time the script runs, it checks this property, reads all keyframes from this property, and then uses these keyframes. So this is not hard coding these keyframes anymore in the tool, but it says at runtime of the script, please retrieve the keyframes from this property. And in the same way as we said here, use a property from a specific layer, you could of course also do this here. So if you want to retrieve the properties of the selected layer or a layer with a particular name or whatever, you could go to layer properties and use this entry here. And now let's say we want to always use the position, but not the position of exactly this layer here, but the position of a particular other layer. So for example, if you enter here 1, it would mean the first layer of the currently open comp, or if you duplicate this here, it would retrieve the keyframes from the position of the currently active comp. Yeah, so here you can really control from which keyframes you want to use. You can either use hard-coded keyframes, which is the default, or with this list of keyframes, you can dynamically read keyframes from a property. And technically, if you wonder what kind of data actually this block here produces, this comes out as a text. So it's a text that looks like this. It's internally it's like a JSON data text that this block here produces. And this means you could also in one script, for example, use this here to retrieve some keyframes and then, let's say, write those to a text file or so. And then in another script, load this text file and paste the data of the text file right into this parameter to make use of those keyframes again. So you can even store these keyframes in files temporarily if you want. So I guess this is all you need to know about working with multiple keyframes, about this block here. Another thing that might be interesting is working with individual keyframes. So if you just want to create a single keyframe, this might be a bit overkill, and instead you can use this add single keyframe. Again, you can add a single keyframe to the position here, for example. So we can just click here to use this property at a specific time and with a value. And now to get such a value, the easiest way is again to use this refresh button. Let's say, for example, we want to apply here to the opacity some keyframe, and we want this opacity to be 65%, for example. So we can just select this opacity and click here, and it will paste in the 65 for you. And for the 65, you could have entered this, of course, also manually. If you have more complex values, like your position value, refresh, you can see it pastes in also those complex numbers. Here you can see there are multiple numbers with these square brackets. It deals for all the formatting for you. You can load any value you want in here. Let's go here for the opacity value again, because we want to apply to the opacity. And let's see if this is working. If we run it here, run script, it pastes opacity value of 65. I go to another point in time and go maybe a little bit lower here and go here, run the script again, and it inserted a keyframe with 65 again. So this is just creating linear keyframes, or with the default easing keyframes. Yeah, if you need more keyframe easing control, you either need to use the block to paste multiple keyframes, which technically can also just paste a single one, or use presets, as I mentioned before. So finally, what else do we find here in our category keyframes? You can also delete keyframes. So if you want to delete all keyframes of a property, let's say we want to delete all position properties, all position keyframes of this layer here, I just connect the property here, run the tool, and you can see they are all deleted. If you want to say, I want to just delete all keyframes behind the current time, for example, let me again retrieve here the current time of the active composition. You can say with time greater or equal than the current time. You can also have a less or equal limit, and make sure we change keyframes of the opacity here. So we connect the opacity property and run the script, and we can see also only after the current time the keyframes have been deleted. This is deletion of keyframes. And finally, you can retrieve the time of keyframes. Yeah. So this block is pretty straightforward. You just give it the property whose keyframes you are interested in, and then you give it a time, and then it retrieves the keyframe that is nearest to this time, and you can also just look in one direction. So you can say, I'm interested in keyframes only before or at this time, or after or at this time, or only before or after. And this is pretty cool because it allows you to also loop over keyframes very effectively. So let me show you how we do this. I first create a value for the property whose keyframes we want to loop over, and then I create another variable for the current key time. And let me actually initialize these two values. We want to set some property, so we can just steal this here. Yeah, and let's say we want to loop over the keyframes of this position here. So we click here, refresh, and now we've got this property here. And then we want to set the key time at the beginning to the time of the first keyframe. So how do we get this? We say at time 0 or after. Yeah, so we say first keyframe after or at time 0. So after or at the beginning of the comp. If you want to even iterate over keyframes that are not visible, so before the beginning of the comp, you could also set this here to a huge negative number, for example. You want to have the keyframe of this property. So we add the property here. Now we've got the time of the first keyframe, and now we want to loop over all those keyframes, so we need a loop. We go here and choose a while loop. And how long do we want to do this? Well, we want to do this until this function here returns null, because if there has no keyframe been found by this function, then it will return the special logic value null. And so we do this until or as long as this does not equal null. Yeah, so we want our key time not to be null, and as long as this is the case, we want to do something with the key at the current time. Yeah, let's say we want to alert it, for example, user interface, and alert some message. Maybe we can do some detailed output here, so to get some idea what we can do with it. We can say something like key at time $1 with value $2, for example. So we want to have the key time and the key value. The key time is here in our variable key time. Yeah. And now to retrieve a single value, what you can use is in a layer property, the get attribute value of our property. So this retrieves the value of the property that we are looking at, and it actually retrieves this value if the property is keyframed at the current time. So we should make sure that before that we set the current time. So here our current time indicator is an attribute of the composition. So we set the attribute current time of the active composition to our key time. Yeah. So again, here we retrieve our key time of the first keyframe. Now we move our current time indicator there, and then alert a message that reports this time and the value of the key. And after that, we want to go to the next key. Yeah. So we can duplicate this here and say, now we set the keyframe to the next keyframe, essentially. We set the key time to the next keyframe, essentially. And how do we find the next one? Well, we say we want to look at the first keyframe after our current key time. So we just take this and duplicate here. So the entire program now works as follows. Here we choose the property whose keyframes we want to loop over. Here we set the key time to the time of the first keyframe. And now, as long as still the key time is a valid time, yeah, we move our current time indicator there, print the information about this keyframe, and then move on to the next keyframe. And this will happen as long as a next keyframe is found after the current one. Let's see how this is looking like. We run this tool, and you can see it goes to the first keyframe here and says key at time 0.25 seconds with value, this value here. And now it goes to the next key time and reports the time and the value. And you can see it's doing this for all these different keys. And now our program stopped. So this is how you can loop over keyframes. And very last remark about keyframes. You've seen that you can get the value of a property, and this will get the value at the current time if the property has keyframes. And it's the same also for setting the value. So if you go to layer properties and say set attribute value of a property, then it will also, if the property is not keyframed, it will change the value here effectively for the entire time. But if it has keyframes, it will automatically insert a new keyframe at the current time or override the keyframe at the current time and only change the value at this time. So just the basic set attribute block is also an option to change individual keyframes, but this will, in contrast to the add single keyframe. So these two are actually rather similar, except that this one only creates a keyframe if there are already keyframes on the property, whereas this one here always creates a keyframe even if there is no keyframe yet. And here you can explicitly set a time, whereas this one implicitly always uses the current time. Okay, that's the overview of working with keyframes in automation blocks. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a ton of things, and I'm looking forward to see you in the next tutorial.